Floxed, how to recover from Cipro. Hi, I'm Chris Masterjohn, and I have a PhD in nutritional sciences. I am not a medical doctor, and nothing contained in this episode may be construed as medical or nutritional advice of any kind, or a substitute therefore. This episode is meant purely as scientific education. If you wish to act on any ideas presented in this episode, please consult your physician first, and never take anything herein as a reason to contradict medical advice. With that said, enjoy the episode.
Nancy Weinbarger says, thank you so much for doing these Q&As and for putting out so much valuable content. You're welcome, Nancy. Thank you for your appreciation. I was wondering if you had any thoughts on the best ways to achieve optimum hydration. So, very related to the last question. Since starting menopause last year and the near simultaneous onslaught of symptoms from Cipro toxicity, very sorry to hear that. I feel like I'm shriveling up from the inside out with tendinopathy, hamstrings and Achilles, dry eyes, dry mouth, scalloped tongue that feels like it's burning, vertical ridges in my thumbnails, itchy scalp, and suddenly rapidly aging skin. I drink water and herbal teas throughout the day, but I do find that I crave salt. So recently I've been starting the day with around 24 to 30 ounces of super salty water. I make my own LMNT with pink sea salt. Cool. Pink sea salt, a little potassium chloride, concentrates minerals, which are high in magnesium. But I haven't noticed any significant difference. Do I just need to be patient, or does any other ideas jump out at you? And then Will Estes adds, potassium chloride is associated with small intestinal lesions, which in rare cases can be serious enough to require surgical removal of part of the ulcerated bowel. Okay, so that's a separate thing, and I'll address that next. Nancy says, yikes, thanks for the info to Will. Okay, let's deal with this one at a time. So first of all, it doesn't sound to me like your issue is hydration, because you have broad-based symptoms in multiple different organs and tissues following Cipro toxicity. So it sounds to me like you're dealing with dysfunctional energy metabolism from Cipro toxicity. And Cipro toxicity can get worse than that. But it's terrible, and I'm sorry to hear that you're dealing with that. So, I mean, I do think that if you're craving salt, you should obey your craving for salt. That salt will help hydrate you. The bottom line of sort of the 80-20 of hydration, or just the 80 of it. The 80% of hydration techniques that give you, the 20% of hydration techniques that give you 80% of your results, or something like that. Is going to be salt hydrates the outside of cells, potassium hydrates the inside of cells. Energy is needed for salt and potassium to do either of those things, and water taken to thirst is the substance of hydration. So you need good energy metabolism, you need salt, potassium, and water obeying thirst, and you need good energy metabolism. So if you crave salt and you're thirsty, you should get the salt, and you should obey your thirst. But if you're suffering from Cipro toxicity, and if some event causes multiple symptoms in different tissues and organs, that is a primary reason to suspect a failure of mitochondrial energy metabolism. And if anything follows Cipro, that is a primary reason to suspect a failure of mitochondrial energy metabolism. And the two things together overwhelmingly suggest that this isn't 80-20 for you. It's probably more like 99-1 is mitochondrial energy metabolism is going to be limiting for your ability to regulate electrolyte flux to maintain your hydration. And a lot of these things probably have nothing to do with hydration, but are a direct result, or rather not direct, a secondary indirect result of the failure of mitochondrial energy metabolism. So I have been doing some limited research on Cipro and brainstorming some educated guesswork around recovering mitochondrial energy metabolism health. And there are multiple hypotheses around Cipro toxicity mechanisms, but the bulk of the thought is in damaging mitochondrial DNA and basically just leading to defective mitochondria. And so it seems to me like the best strategies around regaining health after ciprotoxicity, and this is all educated guesswork. None of this is tested in randomized controlled trials, and I'm not a medical doctor, and this is not medical advice. But it seems like the most promising hypotheses would be around promoting mitophagy and mitochondrial biogenesis. And so mitophagy and mitochondrial biogenesis are generally two totally opposite poles of metabolism, where mitophagy is a fasting cycle phenomenon and mitochondrial biogenesis is a fed state phenomenon. And so probably whatever you can do to maximize the depth of your cycling in the fast and fed state is probably the most promising thing you can do for mitochondrial turnover. So if you imagine fed state, fasting state, where, this is energy in the fasting state, this is energy in the fed state, and you're cycling in a wave, what you want to do is, instead of having a wave like this, you want to increase the amplitude as much as possible to get really deep fasting cycle, really deep feeding cycle. Now, I'll caveat that by saying, if you don't respond well to fasting, you probably want to start by hammering the lever on the feeding cycle, because, if you just imagine the worst case scenario where the preponderance of your mitochondria are defective, then too much fasting is going to worsen energy metabolism, worsen the fact that you have don't have good ATP levels, and just worsen everything. And so what you want to do in that situation is focus on growing new mitochondria rather than focusing first on breaking down the mitochondria you have. So when in doubt, put the pedal to the metal on mitochondrial biogenesis before until you feel well enough to start deepening the fasting part of the wave. And again, this is educated speculation here based on my reading of all these things and trying to put something together that could be useful. And so on the, I think I have some notes, and so if I pull them up, I can go through this faster rather than thinking about it. So let me see if I can pull them up real fast. Is this it? Okay, yeah, here's my notes. Okay, so when you're trying to promote mitochondrial biogenesis, now granted, if you look in the research out there, you're going to find things like, exercise helps promote mitochondrial biogenesis. True, but what exercise is doing is basically giving you the signal to make new mitochondria rather than giving you the resources to do it. So I wouldn't lead with exercise. Exercise is really something that you probably want to put in your fasting state when you are trying to deepen the amplitude of the fasting part of the wave. And what it's doing there is basically probably going to help you aggravate the fasting state, increase mitochondrial autophagy or mitophagy, and then the stimulus from the energy depletion will then act to potentiate the fed state phenomenon when you go back into the fed state of mitochondrial biogenesis. But if you're energy metabolism is failing from a recently getting floxed, then I don't think that's the time to focus on exercise, because you already have ATP depletion, most likely, which is most likely already sort of maxing out your body's desire to make new mitochondria. And so what you really want to do is be maximally rested and fed. And so the main signaling pathways for mitochondrial biogenesis in those cases are mTOR. A lot of people in the longevity space are all trying to minimize their mTOR signaling, but mTOR is, you want to put the pedal to the metal on mTOR when you are trying to regenerate anything in the body, including mitochondria. And so that means calories, it means carbs, and it means protein. And it specifically means animal protein, and it means maxing your methylation capacity. And methylation in the fed state, as a fed state phenomenon, is primarily driven by methionine, not folate and B12 and those other things. Those are really helping keep your methylation up in the fasting state. So you do want to eat all the methyl donors you can, but it's methionine that's really the big one. And it's possible that you want to experiment with SAMe, because if your ATP levels are depleted, then probably what you'll find is on a Genova methylation panel, your methionine to SAMe ratio is high because you're not engaging in the magnesium ATP dependent conversion of methionine to SAMe. And that's really important because if you're not making SAMe, you are not maximizing your mTOR signaling, which means you are not getting the signal to regenerate your mitochondria. And so that's a vicious cycle where defective mitochondria mean less ATP, mean less SAMe, mean less mTOR signaling, mean less mitochondrial biogenesis, which makes you stuck with your defective mitochondria. So 400 to 1600 milligrams per day of SAMe, tested out slowly, titrating up, spread out across the day, to really step on the methylation dependent mTOR activation is probably something you very much want to do in the fed state. So to summarize, fed state means calories, high protein, high carb, lots of insulin signaling from that protein and carb, and lots of methylation support with an emphasis on sulfur amino acid consumption from animal protein, testing out SAMe as an adjunct to that at up to 1600 milligrams per day. Once you feel well enough to tolerate fasting or to tolerate exercise without throwing you back into everything getting worse, which is probably, and feel free to push this out as much as you feel the need to, because what you do want to, so you want to focus on maximizing the fed state amplitude first, and just focus on that until you start to feel better enough to tolerate fasting and to tolerate exercise. And when you test fasting and exercise, test them very gently to make sure you tolerate them without some kind of post-exercise, post-fasting slump back into the symptoms. But on an as tolerated basis, start to deepen your fasting amplitude. And deepening the fasting amplitude means supplement with nicotinamide riboside in the early part of a fasting period. Don't take SAMe while you're fasting. Only take it in the fed state. If you tolerate fasting and exercise, start to combine fasting and exercise. So fasted exercise will help deepen the fasting state. And if you get to the point where you can tolerate a longer fast lasting multiple days, start to pair the fasting with resveratrol taken in 1 gram or higher amounts for the first, maybe the day before the fasting period and the first half of the fasting period. And don't take any methylation support or SAMe supplements during the fasting at all. And then as you get to the last half of your fasting period, stop the resveratrol. I would say during the fasting period, continue to take nicotinamide riboside. I have milk thistle in here, and I forgot the reason I put milk thistle in here. I'll have to come back to it later. But what I have in my notes is nicotinamide and riboside can be taken throughout the fast, but no methylation support, no SAMe. And then when you refeed, you really want to step the pedal to the metal again and very much deepen the go into a very deep refeed with protein, calories, rest, methylation support, and SAMe. During the fed state, not the fasted state, in addition to SAMe, arginine and leucine are both supplements that you could try adding to help activate mTOR in other ways. So SAMe, arginine, and leucine are kind of targeting different ways of hitting mTOR. Eating animal protein is probably enough to get the arginine and leucine. The SAMe is the thing that you might not be able to produce because it depends on ATP to convert methionine to SAMe. But adding arginine and leucine are not going to hurt. Okay, as far as Will's point, so Nancy adds, so 48-hour fast once a month would probably be better than IF every day. And wow, this is invaluable. Thank you. You're welcome. You have to experiment with that. So what I would say is, so first of all, the intermittent fasting thing, if you're doing 1 meal a day, the issue with that is that some of the things that you do, the issue with that is it doesn't get that deep, right? And so you certainly, if you do 1 meal a day and you intermittent fast, and you exercise in the morning during your fasting state, then certainly you're getting a much deeper fast than you would get if you went 5 hours between meals. Like that's a much deeper fasting amplitude. But one of the things I recommended, resveratrol, is totally incompatible with the 1 meal a day approach because the half-life of resveratrol in the blood is, if I remember right, days long. I think I calculated it would take like, don't hold me to this, but I think it takes like 9 days or something to clear resveratrol from the blood. Resveratrol is a partial fasting state mimetic. It partially mimics the fasting state. So you don't want to take gram amounts of resveratrol in the fed state, which makes it incompatible with a 1 meal a day approach because you can't time the resveratrol to your fast. Which that doesn't invalidate the 1 meal a day approach. It just means that if you were to do a 48-hour fast or a 5-day fast or a 3-day fast once a month, the amplitude of that fast will definitely be much deeper, and you can make it even deeper by adding resveratrol to it as an adjunct in the first half of it to get more fasting state signaling. But I think this is very much a trial and error thing because you do want to make sure that you can handle intermittent fasting once a day before you even try to do a 2-day fast. But then if you find that you can do a 2-day fast or a 3-day fast or a 5-day fast once a month, then I think you want to experiment with what's the right frequency of different types of fasts. Maybe you do want to do some restricted feeding window every day, but less frequently you do a more intense dive into fasting. I think you want to test that against your personal tolerance for it, and you want to trial and error your way through how it helps the symptoms. Because remember, none of what I said is based on research of clinical results. It is 100% based on me doing a little bit of research into Cipro, me doing a little bit of research into mitochondrial regeneration, and me brainstorming speculations on what I think would be effective. I am working with a client who has some of this stuff, and I do have reason to think that this approach seems to work on a completely anecdotal basis. But because of that, that means that you have to trial and error your way through to test what works for you. Realizing, and I want to emphasize, I'm not a medical doctor, it's not medical advice, but I also want to emphasize fasting does have a downside risk here, which is that if ATP depletion is causing your symptoms, ATP will be more depleted during fasting. So it's a balance of finding the right mix of the stimulus to regenerate mitochondria, the resources to do it in the fasting state, the resources to do it in the fed state, and not worsening your symptoms through fasting or exercise beyond your toleration. The one other point on this was the potassium chloride. Yeah, I don't recommend potassium chloride. I think potassium citrate is much better. And I don't really have anything to add to what Will said. I wouldn't use potassium chloride. I mean, in a very small dose, fully dissolved in liquid, it's probably not going to eat a hole in your stomach. But it is, the studies where they have had more GI side effects have been with potassium chloride. Although it seems to be much worse if it's in some kind of extended release formulation where it can just like sit in one place in the stomach and burn a hole. But the other reason I don't use potassium chloride is because it's sort of, now that I think about it, if you're taking sea salt, you're getting sodium chloride, and potassium and sodium should both fully ionize if they're not in any kind of wax matrix or extended release formulation. So I don't see how it would be worse for the GI tract than salt would. The general reason why I oppose potassium chloride more generally is that one of the most important reasons to use potassium is to achieve sodium-potassium balance for bone health and blood pressure health. And the chloride is sort of half the culprit of salt. So you're really not balancing it fully when you're using potassium chloride. And I prefer potassium citrate as a supplement. But okay, so I hope that helped, Nancy. And Nancy says, makes total sense. Thanks again, Chris. You're welcome, Nancy. Thank you for your question.
This episode was part of a Q&A for members of the CMJ Masterpass, where I hold monthly private Zoom Q&As for my members. The Masterpass also serves as a buyer's club with exclusive and massive discounts on your favorite premium foods and health products, including pasture-raised and wild meat and seafood, supplements, sleep accessories, water filters, phototherapy devices, and much more. If you'd like to participate in these Q&As, you can join the Masterpass at chrismasterjohnphd.com/masterpass and use the code Q&A, spelled Q-A-N-D-A, Q&A, for 10% lifetime discount. I am currently working full-time on finishing my first book, Vitamins and Minerals 101, How to Get the Nutrients You Need on Any Diet. I will let you know when I have a release date. In the meantime, you can pre-order the book at chrismasterjohnphd.com/book. Testing Nutritional Status, the Ultimate Cheat Sheet, has been newly released as version 1.3. This is my comprehensive system for managing nutritional status with lab tests, dietary analysis, and comprehensive intake of your signs and symptoms. The new version has a comprehensive guide to interpreting the Genova methylation panel. You can pick up your copy at chrismasterjohnphd.com/cheat sheet. In my consulting, I am neither a medical practitioner nor a coach. I serve as your data analyst and your strategist. I teach you scientific principles of health and wellness, help you analyze your data, and help brainstorm actionable strategies. You can sign up for a consultation at chrismasterjohnphd.com/consultations. Please consider supporting my work at no extra cost to you by visiting my support page and making a purchase with one of my affiliate links. Some of my most popular affiliates are also listed in the description of this video with links that will give me credit for your purchase. I will try to respond to comments when I can, but my presence will be intermittent while I'm finishing my book. I hope you enjoyed this, and I will see you in the next episode.